Welcome to Hercule Poirot Mystery. I am Edward Blackthorne. Here we begin this mystery. The rain that wouldn't stop. Her last breath tasted of expensive champagne and unspeakable betrayal. 6 days of biblical rain-trap guests at Ashworth Manor, where anonymous letters threaten buried secrets. When bodies surface from flooded graves, which guest planned murder beneath the storm's perfect cover? Listen carefully, every detail matters. Where are you listening from tonight? Who's your prime suspect so far? The autumn rain had been falling for 6 relentless days when the guests of Ashworth Manor began to realize that nature had become their jailer. What had begun as gentle October showers had transformed into a biblical deluge, turning the winding country roads into treacherous rivers of mud and cutting the grand estate off from civilization as effectively as if they had been marooned on a desert island. The telephone lines had succumbed to the storm on the 3rd day, and the wireless had fallen silent the night before, leaving the inhabitants of the manor trapped in an elegant prison of their own making. Lady Beatrice Ashworth stood at the towering windows of the main drawing room, her reflection ghost-like against the rain-streaked glass. At 62, she remained a formidable presence. Her silver hair swept into an impeccable chignon, her posture as straight as the ancient oak trees that surrounded her ancestral home. But those who knew her well might have noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her manicured fingers drummed against the window frame in a rhythm that matched the storm's relentless percussion. The weekend gathering had been planned as a celebration, a reunion of old friends and family to commemorate the 20th anniversary of her late husband's business empire. Instead, it had become something far more sinister, a pressure cooker of old grievances and new threats, with the storm serving as both backdrop and metaphor for the tempest brewing within the manor's walls. Dr. Helena Morrison paced before the marble fireplace like a caged predator, her usually composed demeanor fractured by an anxiety that seemed to emanate from her very core. The renowned London physician had arrived 3 days earlier, claiming she needed respite from her demanding practice. But Lady Beatrice had noticed the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. There were whispers in medical circles, rumors of a patient who had died under mysterious circumstances, of questions being asked by the authorities that had no comfortable answers. "This weather is becoming quite intolerable," Dr. Morrison murmured, her voice carrying an edge that had nothing to do with meteorological concerns. Her dark eyes darted toward the windows, then to the other occupants of the room, as if calculating distances and possibilities. Young Timothy Ashworth, Lady Beatrice's grandnephew, lounged in a leather armchair with studied nonchalance, but his restless energy betrayed him. At 28, he possessed the kind of boyish charm that had opened many doors and emptied many pockets at London's gaming tables. The gambling debts that had driven him from the city were no secret among their circle, nor was his reputation for taking what didn't belong to him when fortune turned her back. His fingers drummed nervously against the chair's arm, keeping time with the rain's relentless rhythm, and Lady Beatrice noticed how his gaze lingered on the valuable objects scattered throughout the room. "At least we're well supplied with provisions," Timothy said with forced lightness, raising his brandy snifter in a mock toast. "Though I confess the isolation is beginning to wear on my nerves." Mrs. Vivian Cross, seated rigidly on the burgundy settee, fixed him with a withering stare that could have frozen the Thames in midsummer. The sharp-tongued widow, once Lady Beatrice's dearest friend, had arrived wrapped in black mourning attire that made her appear like a raven among peacocks. The animosity between the two women had been simmering for months, ever since certain uncomfortable truths about her late husband's business dealings had come to light. The knowledge sat between them like a loaded weapon, waiting for someone to pull the trigger. "Some of us, Mrs. Cross said icily, "are quite capable of enduring solitude without resorting to unseemly activities." The tension in the room ratcheted higher with the presence of Mr. James Fletcher, who had arrived unexpectedly just hours before the storm reached its full fury. Charles Pemberton's former business partner was a man who carried secrets like other men carried pocket watches close to the chest and consulted frequently. His arrival had sent ripples of unease through the household, particularly when he had requested an immediate private meeting with Lady Beatrice that had lasted well into the previous night. Fletcher stood near the mahogany bookshelf, his weathered face a mask of professional courtesy that fooled no one. He was a man accustomed to boardrooms and backroom deals, but the enforced intimacy of their situation had stripped away his usual armor of corporate politeness. Lady Beatrice had heard raised voices from her study during their meeting, the sound of papers being shuffled urgently, and then an ominous silence that had chilled her more than the autumn air seeping through the ancient walls. "The roads should clear by tomorrow," Fletcher said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. "Surely this deluge can't continue indefinitely." Lady Beatrice turned from the window, her piercing blue eyes surveying the assembled group with the calculating gaze of a chess master studying the board. Each of these people had reason to be here, but she was beginning to suspect that not all of those reasons were innocent. The storm had trapped them together, but perhaps that had been someone's intention all along. Jameson, the manor's longtime butler, appeared in the doorway with his usual impeccable timing, his silver hair perfectly arranged despite the chaos of the past week. He had served the Ashworth family for over 30 years, and his discretion was legendary. But Lady Beatrice noticed the slight tremor in his voice that spoke of growing unease. "Dinner will be served in 1 hour, my lady," he announced in measured tones. "Cook has prepared a particularly fine roast, considering the circumstances." As he turned to leave, Jameson paused, his trained eye catching something that made him frown almost imperceptibly. On the Persian rug near the French doors, barely visible in the lamplight, were several drops of water, far too many to be explained by the brief opening of a door. Someone had been outside in this weather recently, and had taken great care to conceal their movements. As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 o'clock, Lady Beatrice felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the dampness seeping through the old walls. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest brewing within these walls, where old grievances and new threats swirled together like leaves in a hurricane. Each of her guests harbored secrets that could destroy reputations, end careers, or worse. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, and somewhere in the distance, she could swear she heard the sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel drive. But that was impossible. No one could possibly reach Ashworth Manor in this weather, and certainly not at this hour. Unless, of course, someone had been waiting in the shadows all along, watching and planning for exactly this moment when they were all trapped together with nowhere to run. What none of them knew was that before the next sunrise painted the sky, one of them would be dead, and the others would discover that the real storm had only just begun. The sound of approaching footsteps that Lady Beatrice had heard was no figment of her imagination. Through the drawing room's rain-lashed windows, the assembled guests watched in stunned silence as a small, impeccably dressed figure emerged from the tempest like an apparition conjured from the storm itself. Despite the biblical deluge that had held them prisoner for 6 days, the man's patent leather shoes navigated the flooded courtyard with surprising precision, and his carefully waxed mustache remained perfectly groomed despite the howling wind. "Mon Dieu," the stranger murmured to himself as Jameson opened the great oak door, his accent unmistakably Belgian. "The roads, they are most disagreeable tonight." He stepped into the entrance hall with a peculiar little bow, somehow managing to avoid dampening even a thread of his immaculate overcoat. "I am Hercule Poirot. I believe Madame Ashworth expects me, though perhaps not in such dramatic circumstances." Lady Beatrice felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had indeed written to the famous detective 3 weeks ago, when certain disturbing letters had begun arriving at the manor, but the telephone lines had failed before she could confirm his acceptance of her invitation. His presence now, when they were all trapped together, seemed both providential and ominous. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending her hand with practiced grace. "Welcome to Ashworth Manor, though I fear the circumstances are rather more confined than I had anticipated." Poirot's gray eyes swept the assembled company with the methodical precision of a jeweler examining precious stones for flaws. "Doctor." Morrison stepped back instinctively from his gaze, her hand rising unconsciously to her throat. Timothy Ashworth's brandy glass trembled almost imperceptibly, while Mrs. Cross drew her black shawl tighter around her shoulders as if warding off a sudden chill. James Fletcher, who had been standing near the fireplace, moved deeper into the shadows cast by the flickering flames. "The storm?" Poirot observed mildly, his keen gaze noting the subtle shifts in posture. The quick exchanges of glances, the way conversations died mid-sentence at his entrance. It has a way of bringing people together, Non, sometimes most unexpectedly. As Jameson took his coat, Poirot's eyes lingered on the Persian rug near the French doors, where the mysterious water drops had been hastily wiped away. His nostrils flared slightly, detecting the faint scent of crushed fern and river mud that had no business in Lady Beatrice's elegant drawing room. The small details filed themselves away in his mind with mechanical precision. Perhaps, Lady Beatrice suggested, her voice carefully controlled, you would join us for dinner? Cook has prepared an excellent roast. And we were just about to adjourn to the dining room. But of course, Poirot replied with another small bow. Order in all things, that is the secret of civilization. And tonight, I think, we shall have great need of order. The dining room felt smaller with Poirot's presence, as if his very existence compressed the air around the mahogany table. He accepted a seat that allowed him to observe all faces while being observed by all. His movements economical and precise. The conversation, such as it was, moved like smoke above barely contained fires. You have traveled far in this weather, Monsieur Poirot, Doctor, Morrison ventured, her surgical steadiness betrayed by the slight tremor in her voice. Surely no case could be so urgent as to risk such a journey. Ah, but urgency, Poirot replied, delicately cutting his roast. It is not always measured by the calendar. Is it not so? Sometimes the most urgent matters are those that have been waiting the longest to be resolved. Mrs. Cross's fork clattered against her plate. And what manner of matters might those be? Poirot's smile was gentle, almost apologetic. The human heart, madame. It holds secrets most tenaciously, but eventually, even the strongest safe must yield to the proper combination. Thunder rolled overhead as if summoned by his words, and somewhere in the depths of the manor, a door creaked on its hinges. The storm pressed against the windows like a living thing seeking entry. And in the dancing candlelight, each face around the table seemed to harbor shadows that had nothing to do with the flickering flames. As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 o'clock, Poirot set down his napkin with characteristic precision and fixed Lady Beatrice with a meaningful look. Perhaps, madame, after coffee, you might show me the room where certain correspondence has been received? I find that letters, they often tell stories their writers never intended to reveal. The study where Lady Beatrice led Poirot was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, its walls lined with first editions whose gilt spines caught the lamplight like watching eyes. Poirot accepted his coffee with characteristic precision, adding 1 sugar and stirring exactly 3 times before setting the spoon parallel to the saucer's rim. The storm's fury seemed muted here, reduced to a persistent whisper against diamond-paned windows that had weathered centuries of English weather. The letters, Monsieur Poirot, Lady Beatrice said, her voice barely steady as she moved to her desk with the deliberate grace of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times. From a locked drawer, she withdrew a leather portfolio, her fingers trembling only slightly as she placed it before him. They began arriving 3 weeks ago, always by hand, never posted. Someone has been watching this house, studying our routines, learning our secrets. Poirot donned thin white gloves from his waistcoat pocket, a fastidious habit that preceded his handling of crucial evidence. The first letter bore elegant handwriting that attempted anonymity through deliberate disguise, but certain flourishes betrayed an educated writer, someone accustomed to fine penmanship. Your husband's death was not the accident the world believes it to be, he read aloud, his accent lending the sinister words an almost musical quality. The truth sleeps beneath Ashworth Manor, but the dead have ways of making themselves heard. Lady Beatrice's composure finally began to crack. Charles died in a motor-car accident 2 years ago. The coroner ruled it accidental, but... Her voice trailed off as Poirot's penetrating gaze fixed upon her. But you have suspected otherwise, have you not? He said gently. The little gray cells, they whisper possibilities that the daylight mind refuses to acknowledge. The subsequent letters grew increasingly specific, referencing investments in Dr. Morrison's pharmaceutical research, insurance policies that benefited Mrs. Cross, gambling debts that Timothy's inheritance had conveniently settled. Each revelation was wrapped in the silk of polite language, but the threats beneath were unmistakable. Poirot lifted the desk blotter with deliberate care. Something resisted a slip of paper, edges damp, pressed flat beneath. He freed it delicately, turning it so the lamplight revealed ink still glistening where moisture had swelled certain words into dark bruises. "Let the rain atone," he read in measured tones. "Before the 11th stroke, the account is settled. Do not think these walls will keep it out." His gray eyes moved to the paper's watermark. "Cavendish bond." "The watermark of your own stationery, madame. From this very desk." Lady Beatrice's hand flew to her throat. "Then whoever wrote this has been in my study, using my own paper to threaten me." "More than that," Poirot murmured, his gaze moving to the French windows where a faint crescent of dampness traced the sill. "They have been here recently. Very recently indeed." A sudden crash echoed from the drawing room, below, followed by Mrs. Cross's voice, raised in alarm. But it was not fear in her tone, it was something far more dangerous. It was triumph. Poirot and Lady Beatrice descended the grand staircase with swift precision, the crash still echoing through the manor's ancient corridors. They found the drawing room transformed into a tableau of destruction and revelation. The priceless Ming vase that had graced the central pedestal for 3 generations lay shattered across the Persian rug, its fragments catching the firelight like accusations made manifest. Mrs. Cross stood amid the wreckage, no longer the composed widow, but something far more dangerous, a woman who had finally found her weapon. In her trembling hands, she clutched a leather portfolio that had been concealed within the vase's hollow base, its pages yellowed with age and dark with secrets that should have remained buried. 20 years, she whispered, her voice carrying the accumulated venom of decades. 20 years. I've wondered why my husband died so conveniently after discovering Charles's little arrangements. Doctor. Morrison had gone pale as parchment, her physician's steady hands now shaking visibly. Timothy Ashworth gripped his brandy glass so tightly that his knuckles showed white, while James Fletcher emerged from the shadows near the bookshelf, his businessman's composure cracking like ice in spring. Poirot moved with characteristic precision to examine the scene, his gray eyes noting the deliberate way the vase had been struck, not accidentally knocked over, but purposefully shattered to reveal its hidden contents. His gaze lingered on the damp French doors, where fresh mud still clung to the brass handles. "The portfolio," he observed quietly. "It was placed there recently, was it not? After the storm began, when someone knew it would be discovered in exactly this manner." Mrs. Cross's triumphant expression faltered slightly as Poirot's implication sank in. The grandfather clock began its ominous progression toward 10, and somewhere in the darkness above them, a floorboard creaked with the weight of someone who should not have been there. The creaking floorboard above sent a chill through the assembled group that had nothing to do with the storm's penetrating cold. Poirot's head tilted with the precision of a hunting hound detecting prey, his gray eyes tracking the sound as it moved across the ceiling toward the main staircase. "Jameson," Lady Beatrice called, her voice sharp with authority masking fear. "Are you upstairs?" Silence answered her, broken only by the rain's relentless percussion and the whisper of wind through the manor's ancient bones. The butler should have been in the kitchen at this hour, supervising the evening's cleanup, not prowling the upper corridors where private chambers held their own secrets. Mrs. Cross, her hands trembling with barely contained emotion, fumbled with the portfolio's clasp. As it opened, yellowed documents spilled across the Persian rug, mingling with porcelain fragments like accusations scattered among evidence. Lady Beatrice gasped, recognizing the distinctive letterhead of her late husband's company, but these were not mere business correspondence. Financial records, payment authorizations, and cryptic notations in Charles's familiar handwriting painted a picture of transactions that should never have seen daylight. "He destroyed everything we built," Mrs. Cross whispered, her voice cracking with accumulated grief and rage. "My George discovered what Charles was doing. And then—" Her words trailed off, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Poirot moved to the French doors with characteristic precision, his examination methodical despite the urgency crackling through the room. The mud on the brass handles was fresh, still damp, bearing the distinctive tread pattern of Wellington boots practical gear for someone who had business in the storm. Not the refined footwear any of the guests would wear. "Most curious," he murmured, his accent lending gravity to the observation. "The intruder did not come from outside tonight. They have been here all along, waiting for the precise moment when discovery would create maximum disruption. Doctor." Morrison stepped closer to the fireplace, her medical training warring with instincts that screamed danger. Timothy Ashworth's brandy glass slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the hearthstones, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the charged atmosphere. Above them, the footsteps began their measured descent toward the drawing room, each step deliberate and unhurried, as if their owner had all the time in the world to complete whatever dark business had brought them from the shadows. The measured footsteps resolved into Jameson's familiar figure, but the butler who emerged from the shadows bore little resemblance to the composed servant who had announced dinner hours earlier. His usually immaculate uniform was streaked with mud and dampness, his silver hair disheveled as if he had been wrestling with more than the storm's fury. Most telling of all were the Wellington boots that squelched against the Persian rug, leaving fresh traces of the same distinctive mud that marked the French door handles. "Jameson," Lady Beatrice breathed, her voice carrying decades of trust, now edged with betrayal. "What have you been doing?" The butler's hands trembled as he produced a silver salver, upon which lay a sealed envelope beaded with moisture. His eyes, normally so carefully neutral in their professional discretion, now blazed with an emotion that spoke of secrets too long suppressed. "This was placed on the third stair, my lady," he said, his voice thick with uncharacteristic strain. "But there was no one there when I found it." Poirot moved with characteristic precision to examine both the envelope and its bearer. His gray eyes noted the scratches on Jameson's knuckles, the faint scent of crushed fern that clung to his clothing, and most significantly, the way the butler's gaze avoided the scattered documents from Mrs. Cross's portfolio. "You have been to the river, mon ami," Poirot observed mildly, his accent lending gravity to the simple statement. "The blue-gray clay, it is distinctive to the banks near the old mill. But why venture out in such weather?" Jameson's composure cracked visibly. "The greenhouse roof has been leaking since the storm began. I took the gardener's path to check the damage." "Ah, but the greenhouse," Poirot continued with gentle persistence. "It would not require Wellington boots, would it not? And certainly not at this hour, when more pressing matters demand attention within these walls." Mrs. Cross, still clutching the damning portfolio, reached for the envelope with trembling fingers. As she broke the seal, a single slip of paper fell into her palm, bearing 7 words written in the same deliberate hand they had seen before. "Let the past drown, before the 11th stroke." The grandfather clock's steady tick seemed to grow louder in the charged silence, marking the inexorable approach of the appointed hour. Timothy Ashworth swore under his breath, while Dr. Morrison instinctively moved closer to her medical bag, her physician's training warring with instincts that screamed danger. James Fletcher, with a financier's reflexive cunning, attempted to fold one of the scattered documents into his pocket, but Poirot's raised eyebrow arrested the movement. The paper Fletcher reluctantly returned revealed a private loan arrangement that tied Timothy's gambling debts to unissued company shares, another thread in the web of corruption that had ensnared them all. "Most curious," Poirot murmured, his gaze returning to Jameson's mud-stained cuffs. "There is also the scent of iodine about you, and perhaps ether? Strange aromatics for a man tending greenhouse repairs." Dr. Morrison's chin lifted defensively. "He has not been in my surgery." The grandfather clock chimed 10:45, its bronze notes hanging in the air like a funeral bell. As if summoned by the sound, a sudden gust rattled the French doors with renewed violence, and the electric lamps flickered ominously before steadying. "We shall remain together," Poirot declared softly, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "At 11, it appears. Someone has made an appointment for us all, and I suspect that appointment lies not in this room, but somewhere far more private." His gray eyes swept the assembled company, noting how each face reflected guilt, fear, or desperate calculation. The storm pressed against the manor's ancient walls like a living thing seeking entry. And somewhere in its howling voice, they could all hear the approaching footsteps of justice or vengeance that would not be denied much longer. As if summoned by Poirot's words, the electric lamps flickered once more and died completely, plunging the drawing room into the dancing shadows cast by firelight alone. The sudden darkness brought with it not silence, but the unmistakable sound of water. Not the storm's familiar percussion against windows, but something closer, more immediate, seeping through the manor's ancient foundations. Doctor. Morrison's medical torch clicked on, its narrow beam sweeping across the scattered documents, until it caught something that made Poirot's gray eyes sharpen with sudden understanding. Among the financial records lay a preliminary death certificate, not Charles Ashworth's official document, but rough notes in different handwriting, dated 3 days before his supposed accident. The medical examiner's draft, Poirot murmured, his accent thickening with revelation. But why would such a document be hidden in your husband's private papers, Madame Cross? Unless... He paused, his methodical mind assembling the pieces with characteristic precision. The Wellington boots, the river clay, the scent of iodine and ether that clung to Jameson's clothing, all pointed to a single, inescapable conclusion. The old wine cellar, Lady Beatrice whispered, her voice hollow with dawning horror. It connects to the Mills stream through the original foundation. Charles had it sealed after the flood. But if someone knew... Jameson's composure finally shattered completely. The water's been rising all week, he said, his professional discretion crumbling. I tried to stop it, but the seals have failed, whatever was hidden down there. His voice trailed off as the implications became clear. Poirot moved toward the cellar door with characteristic precision, the others following like moths drawn to flame. The grandfather clock began its fateful chime, each bronze note echoing through the manor's depths where something waited in the rising water, something that the storm had finally brought to the surface after 20 years of patient burial. As the 11th stroke sounded, they heard it clearly, the slow, deliberate splash of something heavy shifting in the flooded darkness below. The cellar door groaned on hinges that had remained sealed for decades. As Poirot descended the stone steps with characteristic precision, Dr. Morrison's medical torch casting wild shadows on walls that wept with accumulated moisture. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the scent of river mud and something far more sinister, the unmistakable sweetness of secrets too long buried. The flood had transformed the ancient wine cellar into a grotesque tableau, where rows of vintage bottles had once rested in careful order. Dark water now swirled around toppled racks, their precious contents lost to the rising tide. But it was not the ruined vintages that held their horrified attention, it was the iron-bound trunk that bobbed against the stone steps like a surfacing creature. Its leather straps darkened by decades of submersion. Poirot waded into the flood with fastidious distaste, his patent leather shoes disappearing beneath the murky surface as he examined the trunk with professional detachment. Jameson followed without protest, his Wellington boots vanishing almost to the knee as he grasped the trunk's corroded handles. Timothy, his youthful bravado finding outlet in physical action, seized the other side, and together they hauled the waterlogged container onto the steps. "Observe," Poirot murmured, his gray eyes noting every detail with methodical precision. "The rope that once anchored this trunk, it has been cut, not rotted. See here, the clean edges where a blade has worked recently, perhaps within the last few days." As Timothy wedged a broken wine bottle beneath the lid and pried it open, a breath of stale air escaped, carrying with it the ghost of expensive perfume and the flat scent of river silt. Dr. Morrison's torch beam revealed the trunk's grisly contents. Wrapped in oilskin that had preserved them through 20 years of submersion lay the skeletal remains of what had once been a man, still wearing the remnants of an expensive suit. But it was the gleam of gold around the skeletal wrist that made Mrs. Cross emit a sound that was not quite a scream. The signet ring, incongruously bright against the bone-white finger bones, bore the distinctive Cross family crest that she had kissed goodbye 20 years ago. "George," she whispered, her voice hollow with recognition and something approaching relief. "He never took off that ring. Never." Poirot's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes deepened with understanding. The threatening letters, they spoke of the dead making themselves heard, did they not? Someone knew this trunk would surface when the storm caused the old seals to fail. Someone who has been waiting 20 years for this moment. Lady Beatrice swayed on the steps, her face pale in the torchlight. But George died in London. The funeral, the burial. Ah, but did he? Poirot interrupted gently. Or did someone wish the world to believe he had died far from Ashworth Manor, when in truth, he gestured toward the waterlogged remains. The little grey cells, they suggest that Monsieur Cross discovered something that made his continued existence inconvenient. Morrison's hands trembled as she held the torch steady. The beam catching on something else within the trunk, a leather portfolio, its contents protected by the same oilskin wrapping. Poirot lifted it with careful precision, noting how the documents within had been deliberately preserved, as if someone had intended them to be found eventually. Financial records, he observed, scanning the yellowed pages. Payments made, debts settled, and most interesting of all, insurance policies that would have made certain parties very wealthy indeed, had Monsieur Cross not been present to contest them. The grandfather clock's chimes echoed down from the drawing-room above, marking the quarter hour, and with them came the sound of rapid footsteps across the floor overhead. Someone was moving with urgent purpose through the manor's upper reaches, and the rhythm suggested not panic, but the methodical execution of a long-planned design. "We must return immediately," Poirot declared, his voice carrying sudden urgency. The discovery of Monsieur Cross was meant to distract us, to draw us away from the real danger. Someone has been waiting for exactly this moment, when we would all be gathered in the cellar, examining the evidence of an old crime, while a new one unfolds above our heads. As they climbed the stone steps with desperate haste, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the manor, followed by a woman's scream that cut through the storm's fury like a blade through silk. The real game, Poirot realized with crystalline clarity, was only just beginning. They rushed from the cellar with desperate urgency, the sound of breaking glass still echoing through the manor's ancient corridors like the death rattle of secrets too long suppressed. As they burst into the entrance hall, the scene that greeted them was one of calculated chaos. The great mirror above the drawing-room fireplace lay shattered across the Persian rug, its silvered fragments catching the firelight like scattered accusations. Doctor. Morrison sat slumped against the overturned settee, her face pale as parchment, one hand pressed against her left shoulder where dark stains spread across her silk dress. Her medical bag lay open beside her, its contents scattered with deliberate precision vials of morphine, surgical instruments, and most significantly, a leather-bound journal whose pages fluttered in the draft from the French doors that now hung wide to the storm. "Helena," Lady Beatrice cried, rushing to her side. But Poirot moved with different urgency, his gray eyes taking in every detail with methodical precision. "Do not disturb the scene," he commanded gently, his accent lending gravity to the words. "Observe the glass fragments. They lie primarily outside the window frame, not within. The mirror was broken from behind, not by impact from this room." He knelt beside the exposed cavity where the mirror had once hung, noting the tarnished metal box that sat empty within the hidden recess. Someone knew of this hiding place, knew exactly what they sought, and used our distraction in the cellar to retrieve it. "Doctor." Morrison's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Poirot with the desperate clarity of someone clinging to consciousness. "The journal," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "They took the real records." James Fletcher, who had been standing frozen near the French doors, stepped forward with suspicious alacrity. "I heard the glass breaking and came running. Whoever did this escaped into the storm. I saw a figure fleeing toward the greenhouse." But Poirot's penetrating gaze had already noted the mud on Fletcher's shoes, not the river clay from the cellar, but the distinctive black earth from Lady Beatrice's rose garden, where no one should have ventured in such weather. More telling still was the small cut on Fletcher's palm, too clean and straight to have come from flying glass. "Most curious," Poirot murmured, his fingers hovering over something that glinted in Dr. Morrison's loosely clenched fist. With characteristic precision, he extracted a silver locket, its chain broken, bearing an inscription that made Mrs. Cross gasp in recognition. "That belonged to my George," she breathed. "He gave it to me on our wedding day, but I returned it when he—" Her voice trailed off as the implications became clear. Timothy Ashworth, his youthful bravado cracking under the weight of accumulating revelations, pointed toward the servant's stair with a trembling finger. "Jameson disappeared up those stairs while we were examining the body in the cellar. He could have circled back, attacked Dr. Morrison, and returned before we emerged. But Jameson, his professional composure finally restored, met the accusation with steady dignity. I was securing the upper floors, ensuring no windows had been compromised by the storm. The servants' quarters show signs of water damage that required immediate attention." Poirot rose from his examination, his gray eyes moving from face to face with the methodical precision of a jeweler examining flawed stones. The attack on Dr. Morrison was not random violence, but surgical precision. Someone who knew exactly where to strike to incapacitate without killing. Someone who understood that her testimony would be more valuable than her silence. He moved to the French doors, noting the way they had been opened from within, not forced from without. The intruder did not come from the storm. Mes amis, they were already here, waiting for the precise moment when we would all be gathered in the cellar, examining the evidence of one crime while another unfolded above our heads. Dr. Morrison's breathing grew steadier as Lady Beatrice applied pressure to her wound with practiced efficiency. "The journal," she repeated with growing strength. It contained the real medical records from 20 years ago. The proof that George Cross didn't die in London, that someone wanted the world to believe he had died far from here while his body lay hidden beneath these very foundations. The grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, its bronze notes echoing through the manor like a countdown to judgment. As if summoned by the sound, a light appeared in the greenhouse across the flooded garden, steady and deliberate, like a signal that had been arranged long ago. "The endgame approaches," Poirot observed quietly, his gaze fixed on the distant light. "Someone has been orchestrating these events with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. The storm, the discovery in the cellar, the attack on Dr. Morrison, all movements in a composition that has been 20 years in the writing." Mrs. Cross clutched the silver locket to her chest, her eyes bright with tears that spoke of grief too long suppressed. George knew something that made him dangerous. Someone killed him for it. And now they're eliminating anyone who might expose the truth. But Poirot's expression suggested he had already begun to perceive the deeper pattern, the psychological architecture that connected past crimes to present violence. His little gray cells were assembling the pieces of a puzzle that would soon reveal not just a murderer, but the twisted logic that had driven them to orchestrate this elaborate theater of revenge and revelation. The light in the greenhouse pulsed once, twice, then went dark, leaving them with the growing certainty that their mysterious adversary was ready for the final act of a drama that would determine who would survive to see the morning. The pulsing light in the greenhouse extinguished itself with deliberate finality, and Poirot's gray eyes narrowed with the satisfaction of a master chess player recognizing his opponent's strategy. The beacon had served its purpose perfectly, not as a signal to an accomplice, but as the final misdirection in a symphony of calculated deceptions that had been orchestrated with surgical precision. "Mes amis," he announced quietly, his accent lending gravity to words that would reshape their understanding of the evening's events. "We have been dancing to a tune composed by someone who knows us far more intimately than we have dared to imagine." His methodical gaze swept the drawing room, noting every displaced object, every subtle sign of someone who had moved through the space with the confidence of absolute familiarity. The river clay on Jameson's boots, the rose garden soil on Fletcher's shoes, the scent of ether that had clung to the butler's clothing, each detail had been carefully orchestrated to create a web of suspicion that would entangle the innocent while shielding the true architect of these crimes. "The attack on Dr. Morrison was not random violence," Poirot continued, his little gray cells assembling the pieces with characteristic precision. "It was performed with surgical knowledge, someone who understood exactly where to strike to incapacitate without killing, someone who needed her medical journal but required her alive to serve as a witness to their elaborate theater." Lady Beatrice pressed a trembling hand to her throat as the implications became clear. But who could possess such intimate knowledge of the manor, The hidden compartment behind the mirror, the wine cellar's connection to the mill stream, the servants' quarters. Someone who has been watching, learning, preparing, Poirot replied, his gaze moving to the French doors where fresh mud still marked the brass handles. The telephone lines were not damaged by the storm, were they, Jameson? They were cut deliberately from within by someone who has been living in the abandoned servants' quarters for weeks, perhaps months, studying our routines, learning our secrets, waiting for the perfect storm to provide the ideal cover for their revelation. Dr. Morrison struggled to her feet, her medical training overriding the shock of her wound. The morphine from my bag enough was taken to incapacitate several people. Someone is preparing for a final confrontation where witnesses might prove inconvenient. The grandfather clock began its inexorable march toward midnight, each bronze note echoing through the manor like a countdown to judgment. As if summoned by the sound, a new understanding dawned in Poirot's eyes, not the revelation of identity, but the recognition of method, of a psychological architecture so intricate that it could only have been constructed by someone with profound knowledge of human nature and unlimited patience for revenge. The true genius of this design, he murmured, almost to himself, lies not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. Every misdirection, every false clue, every moment of terror, all designed to bring us to this precise moment, when the guilty and innocent alike would be gathered together, trapped by the storm and by our own assumptions, ready for the final act of a drama that has been 20 years in the writing. As if summoned by his own words, Poirot moved with characteristic precision toward the servants' stair, the others following in tense procession through corridors that suddenly felt alien in their own ancestral home. The narrow staircase led to quarters that should have been empty, but the dust patterns on the wooden floors told a different story entirely. "Observe," Poirot murmured, his gray eyes taking in the methodical arrangement of personal effects scattered throughout the forgotten chambers. A camp bed positioned to observe the main drive through grimy windows, newspaper clippings dating back 20 years, and most tellingly, a leather-bound ledger filled with meticulous handwriting that documented the daily routines of everyone in the manor. Doctor. Morrison stepped closer to examine a collection of glass vials arranged on a makeshift laboratory table. These compounds, they're identical to what I keep in my medical bag. Someone has been preparing for this night for months, perhaps years. But it was the faded photograph pinned to the wall that made Mrs. Cross emit a sound that was not quite a gasp. The image showed a young woman in nurse's uniform, her face bearing an unmistakable resemblance to someone they all knew, someone who had been moving through their lives like a ghost made flesh. "That's my sister Margaret," she whispered, her voice hollow with dawning horror. "She disappeared during her nursing training 20 years ago. We were told she died in the influenza epidemic, but we never found her body." Poirot examined the forged medical certificates with professional interest. Someone with extensive medical knowledge created a new identity. A new life built on the foundation of a dead woman's credentials. They have been living here, watching, waiting for the perfect storm to provide cover for their revelation. Jameson's professional composure finally cracked completely. The new scullery maid who arrived 6 months ago. She worked night shifts, kept to herself, had excellent references. I thought her dedication admirable. But now, the grandfather clock began its midnight chimes, each bronze note echoing through the servants' quarters like a countdown to judgment. As the final stroke sounded, they heard footsteps approaching through hidden passages measured, deliberate, carrying 20 years of patient planning toward its inevitable conclusion. The measured footsteps resolved into a figure that emerged from the hidden passage with the deliberate grace of someone who had rehearsed this moment for 20 years. The woman they had known as the quiet scullery maid stood in the lamplight. But her transformation was complete. Gone was the subservient posture and downcast eyes, replaced by the bearing of someone who had finally claimed her true identity. "Margaret Cross," Poirot said quietly, his gray eyes taking in every detail with characteristic precision. "You have been very patient, mademoiselle. 20 years is a considerable time to plan such an elaborate revelation." She stepped fully into the light, and the family resemblance to Mrs. Cross became unmistakable, the same intelligent eyes, the same proud carriage, but hardened by decades of grief and determination. In her hands, she carried Dr. Morrison's medical journal and a leather physician's case that explained so much about her surgical precision. "Margaret, Mrs." Cross whispered, her voice breaking with recognition and 20 years of mourning. "We thought you were dead. The influenza epidemic. I was dead," Margaret replied, her voice steady with the conviction of absolute purpose. "The woman I had been died the night I discovered what really happened to George. Not a heart attack in London, as Charles Ashworth told the world, but murder cold, calculated murder to silence the one man who could expose his fraudulent empire." Poirot moved closer, his methodical mind assembling the final pieces with characteristic precision. "You discovered your brother's body in the mill stream, weighted down with stones from the manor's own garden. But rather than seek immediate justice, you chose a far more elaborate path." "Justice?" Margaret's laugh held no warmth. The authorities would never have believed a grieving sister over Charles Ashworth's reputation. "So I became someone else, took the identity of a woman who had truly died in the epidemic, learned the skills I needed, and waited. I became invisible. A servant moving through their world, gathering evidence, learning their secrets, preparing for the moment when the truth would finally surface." "Lady," Beatrice sank into a chair, her face pale with dawning comprehension. "The anonymous letters, the careful timing of your arrival just before the storm, every detail planned with surgical precision," Poirot observed, his accent lending gravity to the revelation. "You knew the old cellar seals would fail under prolonged flooding. You cut the telephone lines to ensure isolation. You even arranged for my invitation, knowing that Lady Beatrice would seek help when the threatening letters began arriving." Margaret nodded with professional pride. "I needed witnesses, people who could testify to what they discovered. Dr. Morrison's medical journal contained the real records from 20 years ago, proof that George never died in London, that someone had fabricated his death certificate while his body lay hidden beneath these very foundations. The attack on Dr. Morrison," Poirot continued, "was theater of the highest order. You knew exactly where to cut to create a dramatic wound, without permanent damage, the precision of someone with medical training, someone who had spent years studying anatomy and surgical technique." "Doctor!" Morrison, still pale but steadier now, examined Margaret with professional interest. "You administered exactly the right amount of morphine to incapacitate without killing. Your knowledge of pharmacology is extensive." "I trained as a nurse before taking on my brother's cause," Margaret explained. "It provided the skills I needed and the invisibility I required. For 6 months, I worked in this house, watching, learning, waiting for the perfect storm to provide cover for my revelation." Mrs. Cross stepped forward, her eyes bright with tears. "George knew, didn't he? He discovered Charles's embezzlement, the pension fund fraud, the bribes to medical officials. He was going to expose everything," Margaret confirmed. "Charles couldn't allow that. So he invited George here for a private meeting, drugged his wine, and weighted his body down in the mill stream. Then he spread the story about a heart attack in London, complete with forged medical records and a closed casket funeral." Poirot's gray eyes moved from face to face, noting how each revelation struck home. "But you wanted more than simple exposure, did you not? You wanted them to experience the same fear, the same helplessness that George felt in his final moments." "They all profited from his death," Margaret said, her voice hardening. "Mrs. Cross received insurance money that should never have been paid. Timothy's gambling debts were settled with funds stolen from pension accounts. Dr. Morrison was paid to falsify medical records. James Fletcher helped launder the money through overseas investments. They all knew, and they all chose silence over justice." The storm outside had finally begun to abate, its fury exhausted, but the tempest within the manor's walls was reaching its crescendo. Margaret Cross had orchestrated every detail with the precision of a master conductor. From the anonymous letters that had drawn them all together, to the storm that had provided perfect cover for her 20-year plan to finally bear fruit. "Charles Ashworth is beyond earthly justice," Poirot observed quietly. "But his legacy of corruption dies with tonight's revelations. The evidence you have gathered will ensure that those who profited from murder will face the consequences of their choices. Margaret met his gaze with calm acceptance. "I never intended to escape this night, Monsieur Poirot. Justice was always more important than freedom. George's death will finally be acknowledged, his murderer's crimes exposed, and those who helped cover up the truth will answer for their complicity." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching vehicles broke through the storm's diminishing fury. Poirot had sent word before the telephone lines were cut, and now the authorities were arriving to collect both evidence and confessor. "The rain has stopped," Lady Beatrice observed, her voice hollow with the weight of 20 years of buried truth finally brought to light. "Yes," Poirot replied, his characteristic precision lending finality to the moment. "The storm has passed, and with it, the last of the Ashworth family's secrets. Justice, like the weather, has its own seasons, but it always arrives eventually." Margaret Cross walked toward the approaching constables with the dignity of someone who had finally completed a task that had consumed 2 decades of her life. The truth, like her brother's body, had finally surfaced from the depths where it had been hidden, and the rain that had seemed like it would never stop had finally washed the lies away. The constables' lamps bobbed through the dissipating mist like the wisps, their blue light painting the rain-soaked grounds of Ashworth Manor with an otherworldly glow. Inspector Bradshaw, a methodical man whose reputation for thoroughness rivaled Poirot's own precision, stepped through the great oak door with the measured pace of someone accustomed to unraveling complex crimes. But as Margaret Cross moved toward the waiting officers with serene dignity, Poirot raised a gloved hand with quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Un moment, s'il vous plaît," he said, his gray eyes sharp with sudden intensity. "There are questions that must be answered before justice can be properly served." The inspector paused, recognizing the tone of a man whose little gray cells had perceived something that others had missed. Margaret's composed expression flickered almost imperceptibly, the first crack in 20 years of perfect planning. "You have orchestrated a masterpiece of revelation, Mademoiselle Cross," Poirot continued, his accent lending gravity to each word. "But I perceive 2 designs intertwined here, one of 20 years, one of merely 2. Your brother's murder and concealment, but also something far more recent, far more personal." He moved with characteristic precision to examine the rope that had once anchored George Cross's watery grave. "Observe, mes amis, this rope was cut recently. The edges show no fray of 20 years beneath the water, but the clean slice of a sharp blade applied within the last few days. Someone knew exactly when the storm would cause the old seals to fail, knew precisely when this trunk would surface." Margaret's hands trembled almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained steady. "I cut the rope to ensure the trunk would rise when the water level increased. George deserved to be found." "Ah, but the locket," Poirot said gently, producing the silver chain from his waistcoat pocket. "Observe the brightness of the fractured link. This break is fresh, perhaps hours old. It has not spent 20 years in river water, has it not?" Mrs. Cross gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "But I gave that locket back to George before I returned it when we quarreled about his investigation into Charles's business dealings." "Précisément," Poirot murmured. "Friend my now for is Evenderacide, which means someone has been carrying this locket for 20 years, someone who was present at George Cross's death, someone who took it as, what shall we call it? A trophy? A reminder? Or perhaps evidence of their own involvement?" Dr. Morrison stepped forward, her medical training overriding the shock of recent events. "The wound I sustained it was made with surgical precision, designed to incapacitate without killing. But Margaret has been working as a scullery maid for months. When would she have acquired such advanced medical knowledge?" "An excellent question," Poirot replied, his gaze moving systematically from face to face. "The attack required not only medical knowledge, but intimate familiarity with your anatomy, doctor. Someone who had observed you closely, who knew exactly where to strike. James Fletcher, who had been standing quietly near the French doors, shifted, uncomfortably. The movement drew Poirot's attention to the man's hands, where a small bandage covered a cut that was too clean, too straight to have come from broken glass. "The hidden compartment behind the mirror," Poirot observed. You knew of its existence, Monsieur Fletcher. The soil on your shoes is from the rose garden beneath the service window, the same window that shows signs of recent forced entry. But what were you seeking to destroy? What evidence was so damaging that you risked exposure to retrieve it? Fletcher's businessman composure cracked visibly. I was trying to protect Lady Beatrice from further scandal. Charles's financial records would have destroyed what remained of the family's reputation. Or perhaps, Poirot suggested with dangerous gentleness, you were protecting yourself from evidence of your own involvement in a more recent crime? The motorcar accident that claimed Charles Ashworth's life 2 years ago, was it truly an accident? Or was it justice, administered by someone who had grown tired of waiting for the law to act? The grandfather clock began to chime the quarter hour, its bronze notes echoing through the manor like a countdown to judgment. As the sound faded, a new understanding dawned in several pairs of eyes. The recognition that Margaret Cross's elaborate revelation had been designed not just to expose the past, but to provide perfect cover for a more recent act of vengeance. The preliminary death certificate found among the papers, Poirot continued, his methodical mind assembling the pieces with characteristic precision. It was dated 3 days before Charles Ashworth's supposed accident. Someone with medical knowledge prepared for his death in advance. Someone who knew exactly how to make murder appear accidental. Dr. Morrison's face went pale as parchment. I signed what I should not have signed, but I did not kill Charles Ashworth. Non, Poirot agreed quietly. But you provided the medical documentation that would support the fiction of accidental death. The question remains, who approached you with this request, and what leverage did they possess to ensure your cooperation? Margaret Cross, her 20-year facade finally beginning to crumble, met Poirot's penetrating gaze with something approaching admiration. You see too much, Monsieur Poirot. I see that justice, like the storm, has many faces, he replied. Your brother's murder demanded vengeance, but someone else grew impatient with the slow wheels of your elaborate plan. Someone who had access to Charles Ashworth's motor car, knowledge of his routines, and the medical connections necessary to ensure the death would appear accidental. The dawn light streaming through the windows seemed to illuminate not answers, but deeper questions, and as Poirot's gaze settled on the one person who had remained conspicuously silent throughout the night's revelations, a new and far more dangerous truth began to emerge from the shadows of Ashworth Manor. Poirot's gray eyes settled on James Fletcher with the finality of a judge delivering verdict, and in that moment, 20 years of carefully constructed deception crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame. The businessman's practiced composure dissolved, revealing something far more sinister beneath not merely Charles Ashworth's partner, but his accomplice in murder. You were present when George Cross died, Monsieur Fletcher, Poirot said quietly, his accent lending gravity to words that would reshape everything they thought they understood. The locket that Dr. Morrison clutched it bears the distinctive scratches of a struggle, and the chain was broken not tonight, but 20 years ago, when you helped Charles weight George's body in the mill stream. Fletcher's hands trembled as he stepped back, but Inspector Bradshaw's men moved with practiced efficiency. The cut on your palm came not from broken glass, but from reaching behind the mirror to retrieve documents that would have exposed your continued involvement in Charles's fraudulent empire. Lady Beatrice, her aristocratic composure finally cracking, moved toward her longtime family friend with something approaching relief. I knew, James. I discovered Charles's crimes years ago, but I never suspected you were still actively participating. When Charles began showing signs of conscience, when he spoke of confessing everything, you killed him, Poirot continued with methodical precision. You coerced Dr. Morrison into preparing preliminary death certificates, threatening to expose the rumors surrounding her practice. You tampered with Charles's motor car, knowing his weekly routine, ensuring the accident would appear genuine. Dr. Morrison, tears streaming down her face, nodded in confirmation. He said my career would be destroyed if I didn't cooperate. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was enabling murder. Fletcher sagged against the French doors, his businessman's armor finally stripped away. Charles was going to confess everything. 20 years of careful planning, of building legitimate businesses on the foundation of stolen money. He would have destroyed it all for the sake of his conscience. Margaret Cross, her own elaborate deception finally laid bare, looked at Fletcher with something approaching vindication. "You killed my brother for money, then killed your partner to protect that same blood money. Justice has been 20 years in coming, but it has arrived at last." As dawn light strengthened through the windows, painting the drawing room in shades of gold and possibility, Poirot adjusted his waistcoat with characteristic precision. The storm had passed. The truth had emerged from the depths where it had been hidden, and justice, complex, imperfect, but undeniably served, had found its own peculiar balance. "The rain," he observed quietly, watching as Fletcher was led away in handcuffs. "It has finally stopped, and with it, last of the secrets that have haunted Ashworth Manor for 20 years. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, marking the end of a night that had lasted decades, and the beginning of a day when the living could finally make peace with the dead. Margaret Cross would face charges for her deception, but her brother's murder would finally be acknowledged, and those who had profited from blood money would answer for their crimes. Poirot gathered his coat with fastidious care, his little gray cells already turning toward other mysteries, other injustices that required the precise application of logic and psychology. Behind him, Ashworth Manor settled into the quiet that comes after storms, its ancient walls finally free of the secrets that had poisoned them for so long. "Order," he murmured to himself as he stepped into the clean morning air. "In all things, even injustice, especially injustice, the rain that would not stop has finally washed everything clean."